Two-at-a-time knitting means that you're knitting two identical or mirrored items at the same time. So examples would be socks, sleeves, mittens, and cardigan fronts. The goal with two-at-a-time knitting is to end up with both items completed at the same time. I'll talk about advantages and disadvantages of two-at-a-time knitting toward the end of the video. First, I want to give an overview of the different ways two-at-a-time knitting can be done. So one way of working two at a time is to have each of the items on their own set of needles. So you typically would want to have needles that were of the same sort of variety, like both bamboo or both metal. If you're working with needles that are of a particular length and you notice that your hands behave differently when you are working with different lengths of, say, circular needles or different lengths of straight needles, you'd want to make sure that both sets of needles were close enough that they weren't going to interfere with your gauge. As you're working through these, you can alternate with whatever kind of frequency you want. I mean, you could every row alternate, putting it down, picking up the other one. But most people who use this technique might do something like casting on for two socks, casting on the ribbing of the first one and working, however long the ribbing is, then casting on the second one, doing the ribbing. And then if you're working with a stitch pattern that has a certain number of rounds or rows as the repeat, maybe work one repeat on one, then work one on the other, so that you're making progress on both of them about the same. I had a friend who used to do two-at-a-time socks, and the way she did it, they were each on a set of double-pointed needles. She'd knit the first leg of the first sock, then the first leg of the second sock, then a heel, then a heel, then a gusset, then a gusset, then a foot, and then finish with each of the toes. So this works with whatever kind of needles you are used to using, as long as you have two sets of them. Anything that you would normally use for knitting one at a time, you could do for two at a time, but having them each on their own needles. The other general way of two-at-a-time knitting is to knit both items on the same set of needles. So I'm going to go through a few of the different scenarios so that you can understand what that would look like. In the case of knitting something flat, I could use straight needles if the needle was wide enough to hold both of those items, or I could use a long circular needle and have both of those items on there. The nice thing about something like a cardigan front is that you can have the pieces on the needles with the right side facing the way that you will see the item when it's finished. Even though this is on the right, it's the left side as worn, this is the right side as worn. So if we were actually wearing the sweater, this is the left side and this is the right side. And what you can do when it comes to the shaping is that you can make sure that you're doing the shaping at the same point or close to the same point so that everything matches up in the front. So here I had an underarm bind off, and you do a bind off at the beginning of the row. So I would do it at the beginning of a right side row here. I would work across both of these, making sure I switched my ball of yarn when I finished this one and was starting this one. And then on the next row, at the beginning of the row, I would bind off here. So with bind offs, you're never doing them on the same row. One's on a right side, one's on a wrong side. But then when it comes to shaping, like if you had a V-neck, you could make sure that you were doing your shaping here and then doing your shaping here, and you could visually look and make sure that they were actually mirrored and they were going in opposite directions. The lean of the decrease is this way, or they were both this way, just so that you're making sure that you're making something that is mirrored and is going to be exactly the same. Knitting in the round, two at a time, your choices for the most part are going to be magic loop, which is what I have here. I have one long circular needle, and half of the round is on one half of the needle and the other half is on the other half of the needle. So if you're not familiar with magic loop or the two circulars method, just knitting one at a time, I would recommend learning that technique on its own first before trying to add a second item on the same set of needles. When you are knitting one at a time on magic loop, you work the first half of the round using these needle tips right here while the other half rests on the cable. And then when you're done with this half of the round, those stitches will be on this needle, and then you turn the work and you load these up onto the needle tips and you knit across these while this is resting. When you have 2 at a time, you're going to work across the first half of sock number 1, then you're going to work across the first half of sock number 2, or item number 2. And then for the second half of the round, you're going to work the second half of item number 2, and then finally you do the second half of item number 1. So this one is getting worked out of sequence. You're doing the first half, then you're doing the whole round here, then you're working the second half here. So that takes some getting used to. And also you have to remember to switch your yarns. When you're switching from one item to the other, you have to drop the old yarn and pick up the new one so that you're not knitting these two things together. Then we have the 2 circulars method of knitting 2 at a time in the round. So in this situation, you have half of the round on one circular needle and then the other half of the round on a different circular needle. And it's similar to magic loop in that you're working across these two things, switching your yarns. When you go from one item to the other, you're knitting the first half of item 1, the first half of item 2, then you turn and you work the second half of item 2 and the second half of item 1. The difference is that because you have 2 circular needles, the stitches that are on this first needle are worked completely with these needle tips. So whatever cable the stitches are sitting on, you use those needle tips to work that half of the round. And then when it's time to work this half of the round, then you use the other sets of needle tips, whichever sets are associated with the cable that those stitches are sitting on. With magic loop and the 2 circulars method, you may need longer needles. For the 2 circulars method, you may or may not need longer needles than you would need if you were just working 1 at a time. But magic loop, you absolutely are going to need a longer needle to work 2 at a time than you would need to work 1 at a time. So that's another situation where the tools that you normally use might not be the tools that you can use when you're knitting 2 at a time on the same needles. I mentioned at the start of the video that 2 at a time knitting allows you to finish both items at the same time. This can be a real advantage for some knitters for a couple of reasons. If you tend to have second sock syndrome or second mitten or second sleeve syndrome, that isn't going to be an issue with 2 at a time because you are working them at the same time. You don't finish one and then start another. They're both finished at the same time. Any gauge changes that you might experience from knitting between knitting the first one and knitting the second one are not going to be there. So you're not going to end up with one sock that's smaller than the second sock because you were really tense when you knit the first sock, but you were really relaxed when you knit the second, or maybe it was you didn't knit the second sock for 3 years and your knitting style evolved and changed, you loosened up or you tightened up or whatever, and they're not the same. So you're not going to end up with that. If you put the project to the side, both pieces are being put to the side at the same time. So if your gauge changes, it changes for both of them, and you can compensate for that if you need to. It can be really handy to knit 2 at a time when you have certain tricky bits. I was mentioning before a cardigan where you might be doing the shaping. Shaping can be visible on the front, and it might be really obvious if you are off on one side versus the other. And so even if you didn't do things exactly the way you were supposed to, maybe something got skipped and you had to make up for it, it would be made up for at the same time. So there would just be this symmetry that you would have regardless of any little glitches that might be in your knitting. So let's talk about the disadvantages. Knitting 2 at a time on 2 sets of needles means you need 2 sets of needles. Knitting 2 at a time on 1 set of needles means that you not only have to remember to put your yarn down when you are finished working on one and pick up the correct yarn when you start working on the other one. But you might need a different set of needles than you would be using if you were knitting one at a time. With Magic Loop, you need a longer needle than you'd need for knitting two at a time than you'd need for one at a time. Two circs, that can vary based on how wide the thing is. It may or may not be an issue. You certainly can't knit two at a time on one 9-inch circular needle. So there might be a difference in how you knit, what kind of needles that you can knit with when you are working two at a time. The other thing that can happen is that when you are knitting two at a time, it takes twice as long to get the same linear length as you would get if you're knitting one at a time. Obviously, it's going to take the same number of stitches and the same amount of time to knit both items, whether you're knitting them at the same time or one at a time in sequence. But there is an aspect to what it feels like. If you feel like it's slowing you down, then you might not like it. So that can be an issue. If you just like seeing your work grow, one at a time might be something that you prefer over two at a time. Another issue you can run into when knitting two at a time is if you get to a certain point and you realize, I really don't like this yarn with this pattern, or you realize this is going to be way too small or too big for me, you've had to knit twice as much before you found that out. As you would if you were knitting one at a time. You would have found it out in the same length of the item, but you wouldn't have had to knit another one that was just as long in order to find that out. So none of these advantages are advantages for everyone, and none of the disadvantages are disadvantages for everyone. Some of this is just knitting psychology. Some of it is preference for the kinds of tools and techniques that you'd like to use. So you need to figure out which works for you so that you can decide which combination of tools, techniques, and processes that is going to work for you in your particular project. You might just find that for a very specific project, even though this isn't your favorite technique and you don't normally like to use it, it's good to know that this is available to you when and if you need it. This was an introduction to the concept of two at a time knitting. Going forward, I will upload videos on specific two at a time techniques that are used with different types of projects and different processes. An example might be casting on for two at a time on Magic Loop with an open round, the way that you would work for a cuff down sock or a cuff up mitten, versus casting on two at a time with Magic Loop with a closed cast on as for toe up socks. So let me know down in the comments what sorts of questions you have about two at a time knitting and what sorts of videos using this technique you'd like to see. If you have any experience with any of these two at a time methods, let me know down in the comments what you like or dislike about them. If you'd like to learn more about Magic Loop or the two circs method of knitting one at a time, you'll find links to those videos down below. And I've created a playlist for two at a time videos, which will grow as this series continues. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.